Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Therapy by the Book, the show where we take your favorite fictional characters and ask the question, what would it be like if they came to therapy? My name is William Haddad, and today we've got another solo episode for you. This week's character client is NASA astronaut Mark Watney from The Martian. Boy, this is a wonderful story, a favorite of mine, and a truly incredible tale about survival against all odds in a truly dangerous and unprecedented set of circumstances. So there's a lot to talk about. Let's dig into the background of this character and what they're going to be bringing to us for session today. Mark Watney is an astronaut who's part of a mission to Mars. In the not-too-distant future, I had to do a little bit of time traveling for this referral, but was able, smooth landing. Mark is sent off as part of the crew of Ares 4, which is similar to the Apollo and now upcoming Artemis missions. It's a series of manned missions to Mars where he and the other astronauts are sent down to do basic reconnaissance, cultivating soil samples, tests, studies, and taking a look at what it's like on another planet. Unfortunately, what happens is during their time on the surface of the planet, a terrible sandstorm whips up. And Mars is known for having sandstorms that make the ones on Earth just look like a light breeze. It's really on a whole other scale. Luckily, NASA sends them a warning, and the crew are able to abort their mission, and they're in the process of loading up their ship for evacuation when suddenly the storm blows off their communications antenna from the base, and the debris strikes Mark Watney's astromech suit, and he's knocked away from the rest of them, and they can't find him in the storm. So with time running out and the storm picking up, the crew has to make a very difficult choice. They can't raise Mark on the comm, so they assume that he must be dead, and they take off, and they have to leave without him. Mark is alive. As it turns out, he survives, and he's still on Mars, and he now has to find a way to survive on Mars, which at the beginning seems all but impossible. He's on a planet where nothing grows, where there's no oxygen. The only way he can survive is using the NASA base, which he calls the HAB, or the oxygen in his spacesuits if he has to go outside. And he's got limited rations. The mission was supposed to be only 30 days long. So what the heck is he going to do? Well, if you're familiar with the story, you'll find that he eventually finds a way. Using a combination of soil, potatoes, human waste, and a little ingenuity, he actually finds a way to create a garden inside the HAB and grow potato plants in addition to the rations that NASA has sent over. And this eventually becomes just a story of survival, of creativity, and outside-the-box thinking, and really never giving up to just keep on going, keep on problem-solving. And eventually he's able to reestablish contact with NASA, and NASA picks up that he is in fact alive. And through a long but incredible series of events, they're eventually able to send the rest of the crew from Ares 4 back to Mars, and they're able to pick him up and get him back home safely to Earth. So it has a happy ending, but what an ordeal. What an ordeal. And it's at that point that he was referred to me for therapy, obviously coming back after what I think is over 500 days, close to a year and a half alone on Mars, on a deserted planet, surviving with nothing but his wits for the most part. There's a lot to unpack here. So let's first talk a little bit about Mark's personality and what he's like, and what we know he demonstrated and was capable of doing, and just sort of how he tended to cope and respond emotionally to this terrible, extraordinary experience that he's been through. The first thing I always think of when I think about Mark Watney as a person is that he's a joker. He loves a good tease. He's never short of a laugh, even in the middle of carrying out mission duties. And some of it's, a stress response, which we'll get into more in a bit. But I think some of it, too, is genuinely his personality. We don't see this as much in the film, but in the book, actually, of The Martian, that the film is based on, there's a section where the NASA psychologist is being interviewed as part of the ongoing coverage of Mark Watney's journey to survive. And they mentioned that during the psychological assessment period, where all the mission astronauts were interviewed and conducted thorough psych studies to make sure they were all mentally capable and up to the challenge of a Mars mission, she noted that Mark Watney had a great sense of humor, which coupled well with an ability to function under pressure. Those were top noted qualities, and that Watney was really going to be valuable to the team thanks to that. So we know Mark's a joker. We know his sense of humor is prime, and we see it. Actually, we see it start to take effect almost immediately in the face of the overwhelming danger that he's confronted by when he's left on Mars. Back on Earth, when NASA has finally discovered that Mark is actually okay, that he didn't die, one of the NASA executives, Vincent Kapoor, just wonders aloud, what does that do to a man psychologically? He's up there all alone. He thinks we gave up on him and left him for dead. I mean, what is going through his mind right now? Well, in fact, Mark is already using his humor to both acknowledge and cushion the mortality of his situation, because in the very next scene, we see him say, "I am definitely going to die up here if I have to listen to any more god-awful disco music," which is courtesy of Commander Lewis's personal music drive, who is also one of the astronauts on the mission. Now, it's a funny scene, funny joke, good way to, just a storytelling perspective, good way to keep the narrative going. But it's also psychologically an effective coping mechanism because it helps to ease the fear that Mark was feeling, but at the same time, it doesn't promote denial. And this is key because Mark, as an astronaut, needs his awareness intact in order to keep thinking rationally about his situation and how to survive. If he just goes for humor alone, goes happy-go-lucky, whatever, that's not going to do him any good, and he knows that. But, of course, he can't just go around 24/7 thinking, I'm going to die up here, I'm completely screwed, life is pain, existence is meaningless. That's not a productive attitude to have either. So using humor to both acknowledge but lighten the seriousness of his situation is really effective. It's very similar to what I've talked about with Daniel on the show before, which is what we see in a lot of soldiers and law enforcement officers. They'll turn to humor as a way to function under the threat of extreme danger. But what makes Watney's case special, aside from, being on Mars, obviously, is that it also comes naturally to him because it's already part of his personality, which we can see in the very opening scene when the crew of Ares 4 are still all together. Even in that scene, before anything bad has happened, Mark's making jabs, he's making jokes. A lot of the other crew, have humor, have funny bones intact as well. But Mark's definitely leading the charge in that regard. So we know that this is something that comes naturally to him, and he already is starting to use it as a way to cope with what's a very scary, very traumatic experience. Another thing that we noticed about Mark that's worth mentioning is the use of video diaries and talking to the security cameras in the base, in the NASA hab on Mars. Prior to reestablishing contact with NASA, we see Mark doing this anyway, openly talking out loud, thinking out loud, doing what many of us would call vlogs or video diaries to the computers. But even when he's not recording, just looking up at the cameras and making remarks or expressing himself verbally. And this is an important thing to note as well, because by having this open line of dialogue with himself and with the base, really, for because that's all there is. It's allowing him to construct a rudimentary narrative to his predicament. He's giving his situation a sense of linear perspective or linearity. I'm not sure if that's a word, but he's giving it structure. He's giving it more of a story angle for him to perceive, even as he's living it and experience it. And this is important too, because it allows a modicum of control to be regained over his situation, at least psychologically, if not necessarily physically. And this is important because when dealing with any traumatic situation, having that sense of psychological control, however artificial or, however little impact it may or may not have in the grand scheme of things, it's crucial because it allows our rational brains to come back online a little more readily so that we're not just panicking all the time. We're stuck in fight, flight, or freeze mode, which, as I mentioned earlier, is really important for Mark to maintain that mentality because he's got to be on the ball. He's got to be sharp. He's got to be aware and conscious of how to handle and deal with all the different crazy variables that are required if he's going to survive. Now, after contact with NASA is made, the practice continues and it takes on a new form. It allows him to feel more connected with those back on Earth, even though he's not able to see anyone in person, and the real-time communication is also very limited. But it still remains a crucial tool throughout the mission because now he's not just talking entirely to himself or to inanimate objects. Now his words, even if there's a major time delay, really are getting carried back and are being read or listened to and observed by people on Earth. So, doing that beyond just text chats, on the computer, having that verbal communication and that dialogue, that more larger form of presentation and expression that he makes with the cameras matters too, because it's keeping the people back on Earth up to date in a more real sense. And for him, it's a more full version of communication. It's the closest thing really that he can get to social connection at that point. And something to reflect on is that we are, as a species, social beings. I know as an introvert myself, this is a little blasphemous to say, but we're really not built to live in isolation. Humans and solitude don't mix, not in the extreme sense. And anybody who's left alone long enough without any kind of contact and very little purpose or reason to be is going to drive themselves crazy ultimately. And so Mark, being well-trained, well-educated, knows this too, better than most probably. And so he's able to use a lot of that to keep that at bay, and prevent himself from slipping into that really scary isolation of the soul, for really, not for lack of a better word, for that's really where we end up at that point if we're driven far enough past that limit. Another thing that Mark does as well is he starts to customize the base on Mars more to his own specifications, and not just in a functional sense, though he does do that too, but also in an aesthetic sense that doesn't really have any bearing on his survival, in the practical or immediate way, such as rearranging the gear and equipment of the other astronauts who were on the mission, not just his own, as well as doing things like writing a daily count in Sharpie on the wall, keeping a tally and a written record. It helps to remind him that there's more than just survival that's waiting for him out there each day. And again, the benefit of that is primarily psychological. It helps to keep hope alive. There's a wonderful quote by Maya Angelou that goes, "Hope and fear cannot occupy the same space. Invite one to stay." And I think that sums up very well a lot of Mark's actions and the just the little things that he implements into his day-to-day outside of, I guess, what you would call mission protocol or NASA regulations to help keep him going and keep him surviving on this crazy planet. Coming now to diagnosis. What is the diagnosis for Mark Watney? Well, if you've watched the show, you're probably thinking, oh, he's going to go the trauma route, right? I mean, left alone, abandoned on a deserted planet for a year and a half. How is that not traumatic? And you'd be right. But it's not full-blown PTSD. I'm not going to go heavy with this diagnosis, and I'll explain my reasoning for that in a moment. But for Mark Watney, I would diagnose him with a combination of other trauma and stressor-related disorder, as well as possibly some adjustment disorder with mixed emotions, which has more to do with explaining what he's probably feeling and coping with after he's finally made it back to Earth and is trying to reconnect and get back into a new life home once more. But so regarding the trauma aspect, the reason I don't think it's full-blown PTSD is because even though what he went through was traumatic, he was always able to maintain a certain level of control. However little there was, he was always able to keep that level of autonomy active, even throughout the most difficult parts of his struggle and ordeal on Mars. There were only a couple of instances where he was really completely at the mercy of chance. One was the sandstorm itself, which got him into this situation, and the other was the base malfunction that ended up destroying most of his potato crops, which was a real, all is lost scare. But eventually he was able to come back from that as well. And NASA at that point was helping him out more too. So although there were a few moments where things really seemed dire, he never quite crossed the point of no return, I think, with the severity of what he was, not what he was going through, but of the emotional impact that what he was going through was having on him. In many regards, thanks to his training, his natural talent for using humor and being able to function under pressure. All of these things combined, I think, to help him stay, remarkably functional through a traumatic experience. And this is something to keep in mind. Not every traumatic experience will be traumatic for the same two people who go through it. And in Mark's case, if it had been one of the other astronauts on his mission who got left behind, it might have been worse for them, or it might have been better. But in the case of Mark, I think that he's still operational enough and psychologically sound enough that we can go with just the other trauma or the unspecified PTSD, because he does meet some criteria, but I don't think he meets full criteria. So we'd hold off on that. And then going into the second half of that with the adjustment disorder and mixed emotions, this is more to do with the fact that he's back on Earth now after a year and a half of living in all but total isolation. And there's a lot to unpack about that. We'd want to focus on being away from people for that long. I think the closest analogy I can draw for those of you listening in is probably the COVID quarantine that we all had to go through half a decade ago. And that was all here on Earth, and we weren't cut off completely from the planet. We were just cut off from most of the people on it. And even then, a lot of us, I know, were still able to maintain communications and connections, and in some cases, even in-person contact. And yet, look at the consequences that terrible pandemic reaped upon the world. It was very hard, especially for children coming back after the quarantine to suddenly get thrown into the hustle and bustle of everyday social life. And I know that, for myself personally, it took a while before I really started to feel like my ability to, quote unquote, be social, be socially skilled and feel comfortable really in normal social situations, even with people I knew and trusted, kind of came back online. It was a process. And so for Mark, I think that's something that you'd want to make sure we're accounting for as well when we're looking at his clinical diagnosis and we're talking about treatment approaches. So speaking of treatment, how are we going to be working with him in therapy? Well, it's not going to be as trauma-focused as you might think. Going off of what I was saying earlier with the diagnosis, yes, it was traumatic, but Mark has also shown us how much he was able to, to maintain his control and keep himself from succumbing to helplessness. I think he was smart enough to recognize that in the moment, as dire as things were, he was still able to work. He still had options at his disposal. I don't think that we would need to dig too deep to help him realize that about himself. He wasn't prepared for what happened, but he was trained to know how to respond to the unexpected on this mission. So I would still assess for standard trauma symptoms. I'd probably give him a questionnaire called the PCL5, which is a great questionnaire for assessing general trauma symptoms and severity. Do some reflecting and checking in. But overall, I would be exploring with him questions akin to what have I learned rather than what is it that happened to me? Because a lot of that is already there. A lot of the knowledge, a lot of the insight, much of that is already going to be present. So I think it's going to be more about refining and expanding the narrative that he already knows is there from this experience that he's pulled through and come back from, rather than having to go in and reawaken, suppressed memories or give voice or words to the trauma in the first place. I would ask him probably, maybe not directly or maybe directly, but I would ask him, what does he want his own takeaway of the narrative to be on a very personal level? Because NASA is going to have its official version. The world is going to have their versions of what happened as well, but he's the ultimate authority here. Nobody can really tell the story of this mission like him. So I would ask him, what does he want it to be? And look for ways that he can feel he's then meeting that and expressing that and honoring that about himself. And I'd also focus a lot on helping him rebuild his social skills and reintegrating into a life that now has a lot more people around him. As I said before, 1.5 years is a very long time to be in total physical isolation, even if there was digital text communication. And so working to establish social goals, figuring out what his boundaries and limits at the beginning are. To some extent, I think just coming into therapy on a regular basis. If we're meeting once a week, that's going to be something, even if we're not talking about anything particularly profound, just being able to have that back and forth dialogue and the consistency of that social interaction is probably going to help him improve in that regard. We also see that, at the end of the story, he is working as a teacher at the astronaut corps. And that's a great start, too. That's going to help him get more comfortable in a public scenario. It's also going to give him practice at answering a lot of questions that people will have about what he went through. And we see that he's also using his humor to great effect in finding a new healthy balance with that as well. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what one of his greatest strengths, and as his therapist, what I would work with him to really grow and hopefully blossom ever farther on is using his humor, using his wonderful abilities of reflection and communication to create a narrative that feels like his own, that isn't impacted or skewed or distorted in any way by what the official versions were or what people who weren't there may be assuming or thinking up, and giving him a sense of clarity. That he can always tell his story in what he knows is the best way possible, and using the lessons that he's learned from this dangerous but also wonderful journey that he was on to pass on as a teacher to his students or to his fellow mission members to really grow in turn and be able to to see that growth in others and know that it's thanks to what he went through and thanks to what he endured and ultimately came back from that made all that possible. Thanks again, as always, for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you all next time on Therapy by the Book.